My name is Anwar Majid, and I'm the director of the Center for Global Humanities. This is the second lecture we are hosting this year, and I could not be more delighted to host it. It's a special occasion for all kinds of reasons. Most of you, at least people from UNE, know who the speaker is, but for those who are from the community, I want to give you a little biographical note on him. And the title of the talk being Libya after Gaddafi. Ali Abdullatif Ahmida has been at UNE, I think, since 1994. I've known him since he got here, so he's been a tremendous asset to the university. And now he's the chair of UNE's Department of Political Science and author of The Making of Modern Libya, State Formation, Colonization, and Resistance, 1830-1932. And Forgotten Voices, Power and Agency in Colonial and Post-Colonial Libya. He also edited Beyond Colonialism and Nationalism in the Maghreb, History, Culture, and Politics, as well as Bridges Across the Sahara, Social, Economic, and Cultural Impact of the Trans-Sahara Trade during the 19th and 20th centuries. Ahmida has lectured in a variety of US, Canadian, European, and African universities and colleges, and has contributed several articles, book reviews, chapters to books on the African state, identity and alienation, class and state formation in modern Libya. He has also been called upon to advise the United Nations Security Council on issues related to North Africa. Ali's opinions on the crisis in Libya have been sought by the world's leading media, including CNN, Charlie Rose, and the New York Times, and many others besides. If you want to get a sense of what he wrote in the New York Times, we have a link to the op-ed he wrote for them on March 17th of this year. Given the turmoil and the crisis and the tremendous amount of news in that part of the globe, we really cannot have a better informed person on this subject than Ali. CGH, the Center for Global Humanities, is delighted to welcome him tonight.
Thank you, Anwar, very much for this nice and gracious introduction. And thank you for coming tonight to this lecture and also to listen about maybe the ongoing Libyan revolution and also to understand maybe the history of the present, as I would like to talk about it. I am also, before I start, I would like to say that a friend of mine at the Bedford campus asked me, Ali, would you tell us where Gaddafi is now? And I said, that's $1 million question. I wish I know, but he's becoming more and more irrelevant, thank God. What I would like to do is to tell you a little bit about why I got involved in the study of modern Libya. And then share with you some important events and forces that shaped Libyan society in the 20th century. Then I would like to look at how Libya comes to us in the news, how the debate about Libya being shaped and framed. Then I would like to look at why the regime lost. After that, I would like to look at the geography of the opposition. Well, who are the people who are opposing the regime and managed to really challenge one of the strongest states I would say, in the continent of Africa? And after that, how they mobilized people, how they mobilized, society, institutions, symbols, ideologies, and also some are from modern institutions, some are from within Libyan society and Libyan traditions. And why we are at the verge of seeing the total liberation of Libya in a spectacular 7 months, 6 months period. Earlier, I received phone calls and email messages telling me, the regime is going to fall, Professor, isn't it? It's going to be just a couple of weeks. I said, no, I'm afraid not. I wish you're correct. And they said, oh, for sure, the NATO and the UN got there, the Arab League got involved. It's a matter of time before the regime will fall. And also people had this really typical attitude toward seeing the top, but really getting lost when it comes to Libyan society. That's really true, not only of our media and our scholarship, also Arab media and our Arab scholarship also very, very vague about where to go beyond the state and the great leader and the king of kings. So I think this is another reason why the coverage of Libya was staying in the servers, unfortunately. I could have written and researched about any other topic, but particularly I chose Libya. And I think I owe it to the audience here to tell them a little bit about why I chose to become a student of North Africa and particularly modern Libya. The reason for it was not by choice, it's a family reasons. I had a family that was encountered colonialism firsthand. My grandfather fought against Italian colonialism for over 15 years as a teenager and as a young man. My grandmother, my matrilineal grandmother, was born during that period and also died in exile with him. My grandfather was, after the defeat of the resistance, he was hunted by the colonial armies, and he escaped into northern Chad. My mother was born there, and my other grandmother also experienced colonialism firsthand and lost 2 of her children to famine. When I was born in the eve of independence in Libya, I really had no choice. My family's stories and oral history was about what they went through. So when I went to Egypt to study in Cairo in a liberal arts college, I began to think about it, but more seriously when I came to Seattle, Washington in the early 80s. And I learned English. I finished my master's degree and began to think about my PhD dissertation. I chose without much of, with predictability, I chose to write about Libyan social history. And I think, I remember my grandfather, probably he told me his life story over 25, maybe 30 times as a youngster. And I decided that I want to really write about the social history of their generation, especially when I discovered there is really not much written about Libyan social history. So the background, the family background really pushed me to try to understand, not only give them justice and give them voice, if you like, or allow their voices to be heard, but also I wanted to know exactly what they went through, how to understand that generations of Libyans who lived through the colonial experience, and also how they began to really struggle against a major earthquake that came to them from the north, and they didn't know what to do with it. So it's a really, there is a biographical reason behind me writing on Libya, and I wrote my dissertation about the social and regional origins of the anti-colonial resistance, and I got stuck with that period for the rest of my scholarly career. I thought that I'll move on, but apparently there is so much to be researched and examined and investigated from that point on. but also it's empowered me in a way that I did not anticipate. It empowered me because I know the roots of the making of modern Libya in the 20th century and in a larger sense, North Africa in general. I did archival research, I did oral interviews, and also I studied most of the material related to that social history. Therefore, when I wrote the book that some of you read in the class, in the seminar, or some of our audience here in the community in Portland and the larger, greater area of Portland, it's really, I was enabled more than I anticipated to understand what goes on after the 1950s and really understand the roots, the complexity, the diversity of what goes on now. And I always try to look at it from the larger context of social history, and also from the point of view of theoretical understanding, what to make out of data, what to make out of histories. Now, there is a fact. Libyan history and North African history was dominated by two forces in the 20th century. Colonialism, whether that French in the rest of the Maghreb, and the British in Egypt, and in Libya, Italy. Italian colonialism. And Libya was the first country to gain independence in 1951. Tunisia and Morocco in 1956. And finally, Algeria in 1962. Now, the great big brother Egypt gained independence in 1922, and some claim that the real independence happened in 1952. The second half of the 20th century was dominated by two states. The monarchy in 1951 until 1969 was a federal constitutional monarchy, orchestrated and built by the United Nations. And in 1969, junior officer in the Libyan army, in a kind of bloodless coup, that's called revolution, toppled that monarchy. The king, the Asian king, was away in Greece, and then after that, Turkey. And they established a republic. In 1977, Gaddafi, after he eliminated his rivals, created a new state, a new name, called the Jamahiriya, or the Republic of the Masses. That state, that government, continued from 1969 until now. We see in our own, in front of our own eyes, it's collapsing. After a decade, ran out of steam and became irrelevant to millions of Libyans who were waiting for real reform. I think that will give us a background for some who don't understand what's really we're talking about. Now, let's get to the meaty stuff here, the real stuff. I read voraciously our mass media, some European media and Arab media. In our media in the United States, Libya comes to us framed through lenses that centered on three issues or three assumptions. The first one is Gaddafi as a personality who is above society, and as a figure who was an enemy, then became a nuisance, and then became an ally, and now a bad person again. The assumption here is that great men makes history, which I think, I don't belong to that school of history, unfortunately. I think that people make history, even though they're under difficult circumstances. The trouble with that idea that great men dominate societies and make history is that if Gaddafi is gone, everything will be a paradise. And we know that's a silly assumption. Besides, people are not just ruled by, even under dictatorships, we need to understand the social roots of governments. That's very, very important. It's harder, but that's very, very important in explaining in depth why regimes survive despite the fact they might be repressive, and why they fall at a certain time. concept to frame the debate about Libya today is to look at it through the lenses of tribalism. If you notice that most of our coverage focuses on tribes and tribal Libya and how Libya doesn't have a civil society. And I get all kind of, bless you, I get a lot of questions from all over the globe about, Professor, could you tell us how many tribes here? Which tribe is here? And I just pull my hair and say, oh, yes. This is the son of so-and-so, and so. No, I'm kidding you. It's really the reason for this persistence lens of seeing Libya through the tribal ideology, or we call that ideology of tribalism, has to do with the lack of knowledge about social history, but also it's an easy way out. Okay, there is Gaddafi. There is a regime that's very, very mean and nasty, despite the oil and everything. And there are these tribes, traditional tribes. Now, tribes play a major, kinship organization, I would say, played a major role in African and in Libyan history and also North African history, including other neighboring countries and African continent. But what does it mean when 80% of the population live in urban areas and urbanized? What does it mean? Does it mean that the tribal organization or kinship organizations are the same like 50 or 60 or 70 years ago? It's not an analytical category. It's an easy cliche. The second part, problem with this way of thinking or conceptualizing a social phenomenon like this one is the fact that states sometimes manipulate or invent categories that already are obsolete and old, like tribalism, for its own expediency and its own survival, like the Gaddafi regime did with reviving old tribal divisions and tribal ideologies and tribal rituals. So therefore, I think kinship organizations do play a role, a different role, because the qualitative nature of kinship organization in the countryside and rural area is different than it used to be, because Libyan society is completely now urbanized, I would say even re-tribalized. The third lens is to lump Libya's colonial experience and assume that it is like the British colonial experience, like the Tunisian colonial experience, like even to a degree the Moroccan or similar to the Moroccan colonial experiences. Now the trouble with it is Libya's colonization was completely different because it was a settler colony. It was, yes, similar to Algeria, yes. Similar to the Congo, yes. Similar to South Africa, yes. It's a lazy analytical category to have colonialism as a one pair of shoes that fits all. Because the consequences and the nature of the colonial state is different. And the way indigenous societies face these colonizations is also different. Suffice for us to know that in 1911, between 1911 and 1943, we know at least 500,000 Libyans out of the 1.5 million Libyans died, directly or indirectly because of the colonization, especially under the fascists, including 60,000 people perished in the concentration camps before the Holocaust. With some of you who know my research and my scholarship, I have been doing this research for the last 10 years and collecting the oral history of the survivors. So therefore, it does make sense to lump the Libyans' colonial experience with the other territorial colonization, which are very different in quality. And therefore, not only that's misleading, but the idea of looking at fascism, which I tried to do in one chapter of the book, Forgotten Voices, which gave the idea for the title, it really tells us that even the idea of nasty German fascism or Nazism and benign or lesser evil Italian fascism is really flawed and doesn't really hold water if we put the historical record and we include Africa in the analysis of comparative fascism and add it to the analysis of European social and cultural history, which is going to be the book that I would like to write if you and E will give me a whole year sabbatical soon. And then that will be my big book that I'm eager to write. Now, let's continue to think about the history of the present. I would like to make two arguments, and I'll see if I could really present and investigate an evidence for these two arguments. One is that the Libyan social history in the 20th century and at the beginning of the 21st century are dominated by two forces. The national question, which is a reaction to the colonial question, which is a drive for self-determination, for the idea of having a voice and determining your own affairs and not dominated by colonial forces or foreign forces. And Libyans are very sensitive to the idea of intervention and the idea of, because of their living colonial history. And you'll find every family, people were telling their grandchildren stories of what they went through. Of course, the sad thing, until recently, these stories are not known. The second force in Libyan social history, I would say, is the social question, meaning that the question to have equality, legal, social, and economic equality for the vast majority of Libyans, middle and lower classes and groups, especially in regions that are remote and not really are benefiting from the largesse and the benefit of the central state in Tripoli for a long time. So these are, I think, the important argument. There are two minor arguments I would like to make is that, the Libyan regime was not the same since 1969. It has a momentum, and it was a populist regime that appealed to a larger base in Libya in general, and especially in central and southern Libya, and expanded education beyond the elite, and also was able to have a more egalitarian social change. Free education, free medical care. Yes, the oil that was discovered in 1960 enabled the monarchy and the populist regime, which got rid of military bases and asserted Libyan independence at that time, was able to really continue the forces that began in 1951. And the record is very impressive, despite the fact now that the regime is completely defeated in terms of legitimacy, in terms of consensus and consent of the people. Libya in 1951 had a literacy rate that's horrific. It was as high as 95. It has also life expectancy that was also shocked many of you at that time, maybe 50 years old. I was lucky the genes in my family are interesting despite malnutrition then, and my grandmother lived to the age of 95. So I would say, hooray to grandma. Now, there are numbers that are very impressive right now. Libya has the highest literacy rate in the whole region. Yes, it's a smaller country with 6.5 million and have one of the highest life expectancy as well. So what's interesting about this revolution now, the February 17, 2011 revolution, is that, you know, in Libya, there was educational, social development and opportunities, especially including women, by the way. Libyan women are not like in the Gulf. Libyan women have the right to vote in 1962. They have the right to drive. Libyan women are now at the core of the society, which is a little bit more conservative than our big brothers in the region. And therefore, you find them judges, pilots, officers, academics. They really are full participants in the society. And that was the force that began in 1951, continuing under the military regime as well. Except the contradiction was like this, was social, educational, and economic opportunities for the middle and lower classes, but political repression, political underdevelopment, and marginalization of public institutions and state institutions. And that contradictions was there for most of the 80s and the 90s, but when the other factors came to play, it really became unfolded, because the youth who are really now leading the revolution are the ones who were educated and grew up in the cities that very much was led by this regime. So the contradiction of the economic and the social, but the retardation and the backwardness of almost all public institutions created contradictions in the society. The revolution could have been avoided, as I wrote in the New York Times 6 months ago. And the editor of the New York Times called me 2 weeks ago. He said, Ali, you were right. The regime survived until now. And also it looks like in Central and Southern Libya, it's relied to revive its own alliances. Now, why the regime lost? That's another logical and relevant question. Without going into a detailed analysis of this, because the time's not right for it, I think we need to understand that the state had eliminated its rivals in the 1970s. First, the student union, and I was one of those students who was active in that movement in Cairo. Then, out of the 300 officers who eliminated, who toppled the monarchy, called the Free Officers Organizations, 1/3 of them were executed in a coup attempt against the regime. The regime engaged in a war in Chad. Some of you probably remember that, especially in the 80s. That war has not been recognized until now. And we're talking about at least 15,000 Libyans died in that war. So the nationalist credentials were shaken in the eyes of the people because they tried to cover it. The corruption became widespread. To give you an idea, the Transparency Organization put the regime among the worst corrupt government in the same company with really terrible places like Afghanistan and Iraq and other places, and Cameroon. Also important to keep in mind that between the year 2000 and 2011 or 2010, the regime attempted to reform. It's really a personal rule, security and informal institutions, and also tried to revive, especially after the Lockerbie crisis. Saif al-Islam al-Gaddafi, the son of Muammar al-Gaddafi, was leading that attempt. They abolished the People's Court. They allowed a new newspaper to emerge. They reconciled the opposition, especially the Islamists, and they gave them pardon, and they allowed international media to come to Libya. And they really had a team, very competent team that resolved the Lockerbie crisis. But the old guard and the King of Kings, they really resisted the attempt and became a cosmetic attempt. When Zain al-Abidin bin Ali began to fight for his life in Tunisia, Gaddafi gave his most disastrous speech. He said, what is it with the Tunisian? Why can't they wait for 3 months, 4 months? They should wait for a year. And heck, why? I like Zain al-Abidin. I think he should be there for life. And he was talking to the Libyan people, not the Tunisians, apparently. That's how the Libyan, heard that speech. And then we know that the story that probably some of you heard it, in eastern Libya, and I could go over it over question and answers, people who were the families of the 1,200 political prisoners who were murdered in 1996 in Boussalim's massacre in Tripoli, with the help of several human rights organizations and lawyers in Benghazi, every year would they protest and demanding justice for them. They arrested the young lawyer, his name is Fathi Turbil, and that led to a mass demonstration in Benghazi. And when the state troops, opened a fire and killed around 30 or 40 of the people, and that occurred in Al-Baida, people began to march in thousands, and something very heroic happened. Youth who are unfortunately unemployed, educated youth with college degrees, who make probably, in Libya we could say, and they make a large medium age, 24 years old, stormed the garrisons, and many of them killed, and some they put bombs in their cars and they stormed in a very, very unbelievable sign of courage. And many officers and soldiers joined them. So it's suddenly, in a week, the eastern cities of Libya were liberated, and there are new dynamics that emerged out of that. And then the regime made a second mistake. Gaddafi and his son, the very, very supposed to be a Western-educated modernist and reformist, said that the people who protested are stooges to Al-Qaeda, they are drug addicts and rats. Now, when somebody says somebody's a rat, you do humanize them. And if you do humanize them, this is the first step on crushing them. So that's how the whole thing unfolded. Now, people who tell you that the revolution was planned and it's going to happen, they are really misleading you. It was a spontaneous, popular reaction. And then because of the mistakes and the errors of the regime, things got worse and worse. Now, what were the social the sources of social mobilization? How the opposition began to mobilize people? That's very interesting, because that's really something I know very well because of my study of the resistance movements. Very interesting. The symbols of anti-colonial resistance, which based on communal councils, voluntary armies that are sponsored and fed and armed by people against the colonial state, they are being used at the same time because of long traditions that existed up until 50 or 60 years ago in Libya. And the father of the country, who is the legendary anti-colonial leader whom most Arabs and Muslims remember, Umar al-Mukhtar, he's called the Sheikh of the Martyrs. He's really the father of the country. Gaddafi wrapped himself around, his picture was in Libyan currencies. and his pictures everywhere in Libya. And Gaddafi regarded also himself as an heir to Omar al-Mukhtar, including, if you remember, when he went to Rome, he had the picture of Omar al-Mukhtar, who was hanged as a very, very old man in front of 20,000 people in eastern Libya in 1931. And the symbols of anti-colonial resistance was claimed by Gaddafi. And Gaddafi did something very quickly, very crucial. One of the most brilliant tactics of the regime, especially Gaddafi, he attacked the silence over the Libyan, the colonial atrocities and the concentration camps and the genocide in colonial Libya under the monarchy that was a client state, very, very much allied with the UK and the United States. And that silence, he attacked it very well, and he began to see himself by saying, I am a legitimate leader, legitimate populist government, and he invented rituals of reviving the traditions of anti-colonial resistance as a way of creating a populist regime. So every year there are rituals that about the trauma of the colonial period and how the whole world is ignoring you, and nobody gives a damn about you. And that became really important. What's interesting now is the revolutionaries of today, the youth, took that national symbol of anti-colonial resistance from the regime and they claimed it. So Omar al-Mukhtar became the symbol of the uprising. Now, the other thing that's interesting, the national anthem of the independent Libyan state in 1951, which every Libyan remembers, they did something interesting because they told me that they're gonna revive the old national anthem of the monarchy. I said, oh God, no, not going back for it. We wanna go, you guys wanna go forward. And then I said, no, just wait. Then apparently they took the name of the king and they inserted Omar al-Mukhtar instead of him. So they really were creative in creating new symbols using old symbols. The third interesting also symbol is that in most of the liberated towns, they created civilian council and military council. Military council for security and for fighting, and also the civilian council for managing the affairs. And I could see the colonial period in the interior very much, reenacted again. So the symbols, the national symbols from Libyan social history were there. Now, there are new things. That's where we could see demography, urbanization, increased population, and 70% of the Libyan youth are under the age of 30. So demographic change is important. Urbanization, where 80% of the population lives in towns. And here, remember, up until 1950, or I would say even up to the middle 30s, Libyan social forces, the countryside, the rural areas dominated the cities, contrary to the Middle East and other big societies in the region. As a matter of fact, the two leaders of the 20th century, independent Libya, came from the countryside, King Idris I and Muammar Gaddafi. They both came from the countryside. So rural areas are not so bad. They could dominate. Right now, and that's really the thing that escaped most observers and commentators, today's revolution relies also on the changes in Libyan society, urbanization, demographic change, and yes, educated youth who are really in touch with the outside world. And I tell my students that social media played a role as an alternative citizen media to counter the state. So yes, 3,500 people use the internet in Libya, but 70% of the people, 75% use cell phones, and they have access to 100 or 200 bloggers and websites, alternative websites. Also, they have been in touch with other, international and Arab, bloggers on social media and through Facebook, Twitter, and other avenues. International TV stations, which the most dominant is the Al Jazeera and Al Arabiya and others, became an alternative source of news. So we have something that are from within social Libyan traditions, and some are so global forces, including demography, urbanization, and yes, technology. So this uprising, this revolution has a qualitative nature that's different from old tradition, but also it revives and interprets the traditions and the institution that existed in Libyan society in a new way. And I find that the most innovative way, because folks, revolutions are very, very tough. And they bring a lot of insecurities and pain. But I think also they do something to us which is terrific. They free us to think in an innovative way without the fixed categories, without the normal ways. And there is something, despite the pain and insecurity and anxieties of revolutions and social movements, that allows us to begin to re-examine things that we think that are giving facts. And I think in a way, the Arab Spring, including what's going on in Libya, is very, very much crucial in understanding that. Now, who are the opposition forces? That's another important question, very briefly, and I could elaborate later on that. The National Transitional Council is made of 31 to 45. Some members haven't been, their names haven't been revealed to the public yet. But the judge who is leading the council is a very interesting character. He come from Eastern Libya. He was a very respected, pious, uncorruptible judge. He was a soccer player, very good one, in a team in the Green Mountain region. And he also stood to the regime when the regime, as a Minister of Justice, the court said that 300 political prisoners should be released. Gaddafi said no, and he said, no, I'm going to resign unless they are released. And that stand against the shadow of God on earth, Gaddafi, was very, very important. And he's not also very charismatic. He's down to earth. He's a grandfatherly figure. And he's perfect for the period because he could relate to everybody. And his conservatism and his religious feeling within the mainstream, North African Islam, which is tolerant, inclusive, and not really jihadist or militant, which is unfortunately the image that many people in the United States try to, think of it especially after the September 11. This council included a coalition of professionals, lawyers, academics, Islamists, royalists, and also human rights activists. They all are from urban areas. Now, they created 3 other committees: the executive board, which is almost like an acting government, headed by a good friend of mine. His name is Mahmoud Jibril. He also went to Cairo, to that same college, and came to America. And he came to Washington, D.C. A couple of months ago, and we chatted, and he wanted me to join the council. I said, I'll help you as an advisor. But then he said, Ali, I said, what you're doing is really important. He said, you want to trade places, Ali? And I said, no, I think you're doing well. The other groups are some from within Libya, some came from exile. The finance minister was a student leader who went to University of Michigan and was a professor of economics. Somebody I know, his name's Ali Atarhuni, who is now the finance minister. The spokesman, the press spokesman for the council is another Michigan State graduate who is also a spokesman for the council. There's a military council. There's also prisoners organization and judicial organizations. It's really a coalition. The Islamists also a very much dominant force in the council. Now, let me say a few things and then I'll stop so you guys could ask questions. The revolution surprised me. I expected things to be really nasty in Libya. Bloodshed will be, people were forced to carry arms. Again, it's a very vicious regime. And I expected more killing, more atrocities, more suffering, and more cities would be destroyed. There has been destruction, but not to the point that I expected, and I'm glad to hear that. I'm thrilled that Tripoli, the soul of Libya, with 2 million people, with its museums, with its parks, with its history, with its universities, libraries, cafes, which I remember vividly, was saved. There are threats, however, to, as we see the drama of Libyan revolution now coming to its conclusion. The threats are the differences among the factions will start emerging. Libyan society is highly militarized now. Arms are everywhere. It's human to try to take revenge or settle its courses. That worries me very much. Also, I think the foreign and regional, some of the exiled opposition agendas worries me because Libya could be created as another client state and radicalize a new generations of Libyan again. The open frontiers in the south is also a very tough one. Now, I'll conclude by saying a few words about the future of Libya. I think Libya is at a crossroad right now. It could become a model for the region if it builds its institutions, it has stability, it create a new stable civil society, and also it flourish with its oil, with small population, with the help of other, neighboring, societies in the region. But also could descend if there is agendas imposed by the elite or the foreign power, especially the French, the UK, our own government in the United States, try to impose their own agenda, thinking that they have to get a piece of the pie, of the cake. Rich country, strategic location, a lot of oil and gas, and the need for reconstruction, where you try to say, give us, good contracts and military bases, and so that would be disastrous. But also Libya doesn't have to go that way, especially if we learn the lessons of Iraq, Somalia, and Afghanistan. So it's really a contingent situation. You could go in a positive way, you could descend in that way and create more tension, more fraction, and more turmoil, and Libya could become another Somalia or another Afghanistan, God forbid. I think that we are part of the conflict because the more we are informed, the more we are educated, we'll pressure our own government and will be able to not to make Libya a client state because of its wealth and its location. But also the Libyan leadership have a responsibility. And one of the things I advocated very much 5 years ago, and I think more relevant today, is Libya needs not only rebuilding and stability, but also Libya needs a Truth and Reconciliation Committee. And even I proposed to them that I'll be more than happy to participate and help them putting together, because that's really, you heal the souls and you heal the wounds and the bitterness and the anger for oppression, torture, persecution, and exile, and look at the future, because the future is more important than these vendettas and vigilante justice. The future, you could say that I'm a half pessimist, half optimist. But I think in my heart, for the sake of the future, I hope that Libya will emerge from the ashes with a third republic, a stable, democratic, civil society where we really all need a good story. And there is a potential for a good story in Libya. Let me end here.
We have about 40 minutes for questions. There'll be a person on each side. And do not ask a question before you have a microphone in your hand. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ahmida. We're so fortunate to have you among us. You began your talk by saying about how tribes were not a useful category for explaining outcomes. But we know, or at least I should say, we read that opposition to Gaddafi varied across the regions. The amount of resistance to the opposition and to the Western bombings varied. So if what explains that variation? If not ethnicity, is it class? Is it geographic region? Is it level of education? You know, what are the appropriate categories for understanding the different responses to Gaddafi and to the revolution?
Thanks, Dean Hay. This is a good question. I think regional economies are important, class is important, and also in rural areas, a new, I think, role for kinship organization on the countryside. But I think if we understand that there are social classes or there are regions, Libya is big. Libya is now the third largest country in Africa, bigger than Alaska. And because of that geographical dynamics, each region has its own economy. It's almost, I'm not saying that's like the United States, but I think in many countries you find we have to take the regionalism. I mean, in Morocco, I'm sure Anwar will agree that the Rif or the northern part is not like, the Sahara or the South or the other areas. In the United States, we can, even within our own state of Maine, we have northern Maine and southern Maine. We have New England, and we have the Midwest, and we have the Northwest, and we have the West, and we have also the South, and so. So I think it doesn't mean that this is really getting into geographical determinism. It just allows us to understand diversity. Regional economies, I will call them. I will not even say geography, regional economies. I think that's important. But I wrote about even role of, people don't want to talk about class and stratification, but that exists now in Libyan society. Gender, marginal groups. And I think these are the forces that are displaying in Libya. I would even say there is a shadow civil society that escaped everybody, because the lawyers, for example, killed, the writers' organization, the women organization, the very numerous organization outside of the state. These are important ones. But I think the dynamics of class, region, gender, and also kinship organization in the countryside are all important factors in understanding the dynamics of Libyan society today. Yes, let's take Jan.
Hi, Ali.
Hello.
You spoke a little bit about women and achievement of the right to vote.
Yes.
And I'm wondering what you see as the potential role of women in the transformation of Libya.
Another good question. I think I call it the quiet revolution in Libyan society since 1951. Libyan women, I think, had a very quiet but very qualitative leaps in terms of their education, their empowerment, and I see continuity from 1951 until now. I think it's very hard for any government to ask Libyan women to go back to the home. I don't think that's going to happen. But also, I know one of the three burning issues now in Libyan society and among factions of the revolutionary coalition are the following, how to locate religion within the new republic. The issue of, for example, centralization vis-a-vis decentralization. The question also of women. I think Libyan society recognized the progress for women, but we have also the militant Islamists, minority of them, who unfortunately bring us something very alien to Northern Africa, including Libya, the Wahhabi religion. And I had to say, some of them are trained under the fight against the Soviet Union by our own CIA. They are the product of the war in Iraq, in Iraq today. So they bring a very, very, and also some were imprisoned and tortured under Gaddafi's prisons and regime. So they bring a very new brand of Islam, which is fundamentalist, literate interpretation, and also intolerant, as far as Islamic traditions. And Islamic traditions are very rich and diverse. In that sense, that brand of Islam is going to be debated and contested. And right now, my friend, the acting prime minister, is being attacked viciously by the Islamists because they thought he is too secular, too westernized, and he doesn't stay in Libya, and therefore he has to be replaced. And so this is an issue that's going to be, but my thinking, the youth of Libya, who we thought apolitical, they are not really interested in public issues, proven us wrong, as the youth in Tunisia and also in Egypt and other parts of the globe. They are proving us that they are very aware. On the contrary, I think the fact that they are not making big ideological claims or demands. They're talking about jobs, democracy, rule of law, equality, all the universal demands that I think most people have anywhere in the globe. So I think it's going to be very hard to reverse the social change that happened in Libya. Libyan society, contrary to the image of it, is actually a very modern society, very literate, very very much the forces of change make it a little bit more egalitarian, despite being battered, despite being really marginalized, despite the corruption and the decaying of public institutions. The other side of it, this is really a society that came a long way. Now, we know that in history, things can go backward. I mean, I'm at this age, I'm thinking now, things, they don't go one way. I mean, you could go backward. And things could go even worse, as we know the lessons of failed states in either in Africa or the Middle East or other parts of the globe. So there is no guarantee. But also, I think these are the battles that are going to be fought in Libya, and the other battles that are being fought in the media and in the TV stations is the idea of the militant youth, especially the one who don't want to give up their arms. And Libya has thousands of guns. You have no idea. They spend billions of dollars. So now there are guns and ammunition everywhere in the country. And that's going to be a big problem because the people of Tripoli are saying, we don't want these troops from Misrata and from the Western Mountains. Okay, thank you. You liberated us. You helped us be free. Go back home now. We want to resume our lives. And it's being fought very, very hard. And there are also some countries like Qatar, small, tiny, which helped the uprising, but now pushing the Islamist. So that's part of the agendas I was talking about. There are also people who want to see Libya as now in state of revolution. There is no standing army, and they things can be manipulated. And I will see more of that coming as a way of really struggling over the future of Libya. What kind of government will emerge? A third republic, or a failed state, or something in between. I see almost like there is the Tunisian and the Egyptian model, which, by the way, are stalled now. I hate to say that. They're stalled big time. The old elite is not letting change happen. But these are very well-established societies with long traditions and public institutions. And I see the Iraqi and the Somali other models. Libya is now in between. It could either go to the wrong camp, or come like the Egyptian and the Tunisian, or could even, if we get lucky and the Libyan leadership trust the Libyan people, it could be even better than the Tunisian and the Egyptian models. So I think this is the contingency I was talking about. All right, let's, I think there is somebody in the middle there.
Hi, Ali.
Mary.
Could you talk? Yes. Could you talk a little bit about the role of Sufism in the life of traditional Libyan life in both, and also if it's relevant to today's young people, in contrast with the Wahhabi ideology that you were talking about that is threatening things?
Good question, Mary. I think the Libyan tradition, which is consistent with North African Islam, the society, if you look carefully, since the 14th century, has been dominated by Sufi orders, mystical orders. And yes, North Africa is a Maliki Sunni region, with a few exceptions, small enclaves here and there. But the majority of the people are Muslim, and they belong to Sunni Islam, and they belong to one school of Sunni Islam called Maliki school. There are small minorities, which is Ibadi Islam. Of course, there is the Jewish traditions, rich traditions in North Africa, especially after their expulsion from Spain, Muslim Spain. And also you have small minorities of Europeans who are remnants of the colonial period, for that matter. So I think in Libya, the biggest movement, and some of you who read my work or heard me give talks, they had magnificent social movement in the 19th century. I think one of the most enlightened, called the Sanusiya movement, where the founder was a genius social movement builder. His name is Muhammad bin Ali Sanusi. He came from Algeria and settled in Libya and studied in Fas and Al-Azhar in Egypt and also in Hijaz, and founded a social movement based on education and trade. When the Italian came to eastern Libya and the Sahara, they founded a society that was very cohesive, educated, had lodges, mosques, courts, international trade, and also reinterpret the Sharia or Islamic law in a modernist way to fit his time. The Italian could not crush that region of Libya until 1931, which means that those traditions really strengthen and build the individual. He said, you want to build the moral fabric of the individual. And its followers were not ethnic or nationalistic. They came from the whole North African, Saharan, West African, and also parts of the Nile Valley as well. So it was a remarkable movement. And the future of Libya could rely on that really inclusive, very, very much flexible, modernist interpretation of Islam. Yes, one of my students.
Okay. How do you think Gaddafi and the 2011 revolution are being portrayed in the United States press and to the people of the United States?
Well, I think I covered that a little bit at the beginning, but I think let me add this to answer Kevin's question. I think we have a mixed coverage. There is the mainstream way of covering Libya and Gaddafi as a fascinating somebody we love to hate. And I think I gave the changing pattern of Gaddafi: an enemy, an ally, a nuisance, and an enemy again. That's how our. But the fact they keep asking me, including to give interviews where I have been debunking that image, means, and among others also who are commenting on this, I think our public, I feel almost in interacting, especially with national public radios and of 6 or 10 cities, there's hunger for alternative way of thinking. And I could feel it this time. I think maybe because we went through that debacle of Iraq and Afghanistan, and so there is hunger for alternative way of thinking. And I could see both the mainstream simplistic cliches, and there is also the more informed ones. And I hope that my books will sell more because they have been sitting there only read by students and scholars. But 2 of them were translated into Arabic, were banned in Libya, which made the sales go quite well. I think there is somebody in the middle there.
I apologize for asking an economics question.
That's all right.
But to whom does Libya sell its oil, and is that a factor in what will happen, you know, the influences that will be put on the current council?
Yes, Libya used to be one of the poorest countries with a per capita income around $35 in 1950. After 1960, oil was discovered, and I always tell the story that probably Benito Mussolini will be spinning in his grave because he didn't discover oil was there. The Libya's revenues come mainly from selling its oil, which is one of the sweetest brands of oil, by the way. Even refineries in Europe are made to accommodate that. It's just its composition is very different. And also gas, where Italy, for example, there is even a pipeline in the under the Mediterranean to Italy. Libya is a major oil-producing country. Most of its oil goes to Italy, Germany, Spain, and France. So a little bit goes to United States, not a lot. It used to be more in the past. And 1.6 million, I think, barrels is the share of the Libyan, of Libya in the oil market. The revenues are tremendous, as you could tell, for only 6.5 million people. So I think oil has been important. Oil has been a curse because it's also allowed multinational to dominate Libya's affairs in the past. But also oil, created a tremendous advantage to millions of Libyan. I don't think I would have been educated in Libyan public schools without the fact that oil was discovered. And I was also lucky that I came to America before things went downhill there. So oil is going to continue to be a source of revenue for Libya. And the challenge is how Libyan government, the new revolutionary government, is going to deal with the contracts and the revenues and the laws that will organize the economy and the export of oil. Yes, sir.
Good question.
Yes.
Does Libya have a constitution? And do you think it's still a good one? Will they try to write a new constitution? And do you think it even matters? I mean, ideally, it would be a basis for a legal system and one that protects the rights of minorities. Do you know people in the Libyan Council who either want to reinvigorate the old constitution or write a new constitution that would ensure the rights of minorities and the rule of law?
Under Gaddafi, of course, as you know, he was the law and he was the state. So there was no constitution in Libya under Gaddafi. And one of the main demands since the 1980s was, the fact that majority of Libyans, they demanded a constitution. And that became one of the thorny issues in fighting the regime. I think needless to say that the Libyan people they want a constitution, and they're going to have a constitution. And one of the declaration that the National Transitional Council stated that within a year there will be election, and then there will be a new constitution. And one of the things that you should be delighted to hear that equality for everybody, including minorities in Libya. And I think the language now the council is using is very, very comforting. And I think that will be resolved in a very, very inclusive way. Unless, of course, things go the other way, as I said. But I think up to now, this is one of the top demands. That's to ensure not the personalization of power under Gaddafi, but also the rule of law and ensuring that the constitution that will be guaranteeing rights to everybody, including minorities.
Hi, I read in The Guardian a couple months ago that at one point I think the Prime Minister of the Rebel Transitional Council fired everybody on the Rebel Transitional Council and repicked new people. So I was wondering if you had any insight on that. Like what would cause that?
I think you're referring to firing the board, the executive board? Yes. Actually, there is a negotiation. It's people who are throwing all kind of stones at the acting prime minister and criticizing him. And I saw a press conference this morning. I was going to the university, and then I saw the Al Jazeera, and they said, press a conference. I said, okay, let's just grab my coffee and watch what goes on. And they addressed this. And Dr. Jibril agreed to stay, but he indicated that he wants to resign after a new government will be formed. And he said that I'm not going to continue. The government was supposed to be formed sooner. And there was debates about should you represent every region in Libya or should you really have a small, competent, qualified people to lead the government until there would be a new government formed after deliberation and also election and a constitution. And it looks like that has been resolved for now. I expect that now Gaddafi is going to be more and more out of the picture. There will be more fights and disputes over the future of what's going to come, because everybody has an agenda and vision for what's going to happen in Libya in the coming months. Yes, sir.
Would you comment on the role that the current administration has played and the view it has taken of the current conflict in Libya? And do you see that the United States could have any positive influence on developments there, or is our past association with Gaddafi going to make anything we do there be viewed with too much suspicion?
The Obama administration played their cards well. They know they have a whole domestic issues here. There are many battles and many revolutionaries, true, and pretenders as well here in the United States. But I think they played it well by being low-key, supporting the NATO enforcement of no-fly zone in Libya, executing, of course, the UN Security Council resolution. But at the same time, I smile and I laugh because I see not only the Obama administration, but also the Sarkozy government and the Cameron government in the UK trying to rewrite history. They keep in mind that these governments, including the Obama administration, and before that the Bush administration, they made peace with the Gaddafi government. They even allowed him to pitch his tent in Paris and also in Rome. which is for the colonel, that's a big thing. That means that his own term's there. So I think is it true to say that they were opposed the government and they supported, human rights issues? It's not true. For a long time, the Bush administration and our own government, Republican Democrat, unfortunately played the stability card, or the idea that a strong man is really the way to ensure stability, or because they have good relationship with the state of Israel, or because security, the Cold War mentality, that there is no civil society in these countries, and therefore let's play it in a different way. Or their culture is really either pre-modern or anti-modern. All these cliches that are declared directly or assumed in a way. And I think while I want to say the Obama administration played well, they also want to rewrite history as if they were always in support of the democratic movement and the social movement. And I think this is not true. Final point, yes, our government in the United States has a good role to play. And I'll go back to what I warned about earlier, is to side with the people, and to resist the temptation to impose agendas or have a weaker government. And because the Libyan people were helped in their revolution and their fight against the dictatorship. I think resisting that temptation is very crucial. But they will not be, even if they try to do it, if we are not really involved by being informed about it. The history of our own foreign policy in third world countries is not really that great. It's a really terrible one. And I hope that we are learning from that horrible history of supporting dictatorships and absolutist monarchies. Caitlin?
You said one of your ideas is to set up a Truth and Reconciliation Committee.
Yes.
Can you describe a little more what that would look like and how it would take Libyans through the process of healing?
Well, one of the most very, very important committees that there have been many committees worldwide, especially after genocide and after also collapse of dictatorships or regimes that like the apartheid regime, has been the idea of allowing truth to come out, but also heal people by telling the truth, and also giving a bargain. All the people who were active in organization and institutions that either tortured, assassinated, or killed dissidents and people who were protesting against oppression will be given a pardon or some forgiveness in exchange of telling the truth about what happened. And we saw even something happen in Morocco as well. The most vivid and the most visible committee happened in South Africa, which I know very well because I studied that, that country very well, and I teach a course, late 20th century social revolutions, for the last 10 years. And I know Iran case, and also I know the Nicaraguan case. And the South African case really was a tough deal, but Mandela and the African National Congress decided, instead of really trying and condemning and judging the people who were part of the apartheid regime, they created a committee known as a Truth and Reconciliation Committee. And that committee encouraged and demanded truth, confessions, and also headed by a very respected clergyman who was active in the anti-apartheid movement, Desmond Tutu, Bishop Desmond Tutu, who was, I think many Americans remember him. He was a very, very honest, respected one who will listen to these things, and then everybody will cry and will hug in a serious way, not in a silly way. But the point is, I think there's something good about that. I think taking revenge or executing others unless they committed, horrible crimes, I think, it would be becoming reactionary one. If you want to bring people together and think about the long term, a reconciliation and truth, and bringing people together will bring a new ethics, a new morality, a new discourses, a new values, and that's how we create a good model for the future. And I would say that Libya still fights the colonial period, and of course they're going to fight the monarchy period, and of course for sure the government that started as populist and ended by becoming a dictatorship.
We'll take one more question. I'm sure a student must have a question somewhere.
There is two questions. There is student and then Brian. Let's give Brian. Brian is here, so he has to ask questions.
First of all,
I thought you asked me all the questions that you wanted to ask me, Brian, for all those 70 years, right?
You want to go first? Okay. Okay, here you go. All right.
Okay.
I don't want to go last. So Ali, I know soon, or maybe already, you're going to teach Hannah Arendt's book on revolution
Yes.
to the seniors. And in that book, she talks about sort of after revolution, how hard it is to hold on to that passion for politics.
Yeah.
And in a certain sense, the way you started describing Libya, it sounds like a case where it's a well-educated culture, dire poverty is not a serious problem, it sounded like. And so it's perfect in the Arendtian sense. It's like people have the capacity to care about politics and not get too torn up with social concerns. But then you also mentioned issues of class, problems of unemployment, and these are the sorts of things that I think Arendt would worry. People just want a manager who will distribute the wealth or create jobs or something like that. And then finally, Arendt says one of the best conditions for maintaining that passion for politics is local councils, whether it was the early Soviets in the Soviet Union or, America, our sort of passion for creating these little town councils.
Yes.
And so I'm curious about these regional councils you discussed in Libya, and do you think they're something that's vibrant, something that's going to maintain themselves in the new period that's beginning?
I think Madam Arendt, whom we both admire and think highly of, will be delighted because these councils were formed in a spectacular way. And I think that's one of the things where you could build on as far as the future, because Libya, the sin of Libyan elites since independence is not to build on those local, decentralized, very rich traditions in Libyan society. And because of that sin, I think what we have is a contradiction, long traditions of decentralization and people taking care of their own affairs, but at the same time, a central government that always weakened these institutions. I think one of the important tasks for the new government is to take advantage of those traditions and strengthen institutions, because I think the heart of her argument, not only the passion for politics and thinking of these local institutions, but also it reminds us that unless you build strong institutions, you always become really a prey for all kind of trends among leaders and their passions. And I think one of the reasons that she admired the United States, even though she was a polemicist in that book, is she liked the fact that there are strong institutions that existed in the Republic, in the United States, in comparison with the other ones. That's really, I think, one of the hardest decisions for the Libyan revolution now. And if they can really become very, very keen about them, then that will be a very important seed for stability in the coming years, in addition to the reconciliations and forgiveness that I thought also important in creating new values. But going back to those traditions and those institutions actually will give us a Libya that's modern, but also has its own character. its own decentralized traditions, its own fear and distrust of central government, and this really a modernist, a broad, inclusive Islam. I think these will give Libyan people who they say this is us. Also, a combination that will create a more stable government in the future. But this is a key one, Brian. I think Arndt will probably agree that you highlight that very important, and whether they can do that or not will be really crucial for the kind of government that's going to emerge. Yes.
You actually just answered my question.
I
so
did.
Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you very much.
Well, thank you, everybody. We are, again, absolutely delighted and fortunate to have Ali with us tonight. And he's always available at the UN. His email is available. His phone number is available. So please contact him anytime you have any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Anwar, very much, and thank you.